Welcome back. We are going to continue talking about the spinal cord, but we're going to move outside of the cord and we're going to talk about the nerves that originate on it. So we're going to talk about spinal nerves. So a nerve is a very sort of ordered structure that is very reminiscent of what we saw in a muscle. So spinal nerves originate from the spinal cord, and what they are a sort of connective tissue bound grouping of fascicles. And each fascicle has a whole bunch of axons in it. So we've got myelinated, unmyelinated, and so you've got this very similar structure. And in fact, we've got connective tissues that are very similar as well. So surrounding the entire nerve here, we've got what's called the epineurium. Surrounding a fascicle, we have the perineurium. And then surrounding each axon is the endoneurium. So when we talk about what a nerve is, this is what we're talking about. Now, these axons are, some of them are sensory, some of them are motor. So they are not affecting each other. So some of it is taking information back down to the motor effectors. Some of it is bringing sensory information back up. When we classify nerves, we kind of look at, what information are they carrying? Anything that is afferent is sensory. So afferent, remember, means coming in, and sensory information comes in. Efferent is motor, so this is coming out. Somatic means that it's dealing with something that is very general in its structure, so skin, muscles, bones, joints. Visceral is your organs, so glands, blood vessels, and all of your organs. General is anything that's super widespread, whereas special has to do with special senses. Anything, kind of just think about your face when you're dealing with special. So a lot of different versions there. We will find that most nerves are what are called mixed nerves, meaning that they have both afferent and efferent fibers in them. Some are purely sensory. They only carry sensory information, so they are only an afferent. And some are what are called primarily motor. So it's almost all motor except for a small amount of sensory fibers that deal with your sense of what's called proprioception. Okay, so the spinal nerves originate in 31 pairs coming off of the cord, and they are just named for the point that they exit the cord. So you can see you have 8 cervical and 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. So they become named when they begin to branch further. So when you're learning the innervations of muscles and things like that, those all originate from a spinal nerve, but they don't usually get a name until they go a little further out in their branching. So all of our nerves are going to interact with the spinal cord in what are called roots. So the nerve comes in and then it splays out into multiple little pieces called roots. So the dorsal root is bringing sensory information in. The cell bodies of those unipolar basic sensory neurons are all in what's called the dorsal root ganglia that sits just outside of the root. And here we are bringing stuff in from the periphery. The ventral root is going to contain your motor fibers that are originating from all of those cell bodies in the ventral horn that we saw. These are all going to your effectors. So here we can take a really nice look at the dorsal root ganglion. So you want to just keep remembering that, out here in a spinal nerve, we've got two-way communication. We've got some motor fibers, we've got sensory fibers. But as you get close to the cord, it splits because the dorsal side is always sensory and the ventral side is always motor. So this is what the dorsal root ganglion looks like. It is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. Okay, that is the definition of a ganglia. Now, what else is running through there? All of the axons that are coming off of them. Okay, now if you look at the ventral root, it is just axons. We don't have any cell bodies here because the cell bodies of these motor neurons are in the ventral horn. So you got to remember back to the basics of the different types of neurons and what is a motor neuron, what's a sensory neuron. All of that comes into play here. All right, so we're going to look at the plexuses. As spinal nerves leave the cord, they're going to anastomose with each other. They're going to form connections with each other. So you have 4 different plexuses where these occur. So in the cervical plexus, you can see it here. Okay, so these are your roots. So this is C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, and you can see they branch very, very quickly. So the clinically important one that I really want you to pay attention to here is the phrenic nerve. So here's the phrenic nerve, and you can see that it receives input from C3, C4, and C5. The phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm muscle. If you have issues with the cord here, if you have damage to the cord, you can't breathe. And so that is an incredibly important muscle when we start talking about the ability to breathe. All right, the brachial plexus. This one, you got to know the whole thing, okay? Those of you moving on into neuro, you're going to learn every single thing in this thing. This one's really complex. It has roots that feed into trunks, which feed into divisions. So you've got the anterior division and then the posterior division, which then feed into cords, which then feed into 5 different nerves. So these, you need to know all of this. So you need to know the muscles. I'm not going to make you know the cutaneous and joint, but you need to know what muscles are innervated by each of these 5 nerves. Some of this should be very familiar to you already from working in the lab, okay? But clinically, this is very important in terms of how the hand works and how the arm works. In the lumbar plexus, we've got roots that lead to 2 different divisions, okay? We have a big nerve here, the femoral nerve. One of them that I'm going to point out in addition to the femoral nerve is the genitofemoral. It's fairly small, but when we get to the reproductive system, this is what actually innervates what's called the cremaster muscle in the male, which is important for temperature control for proper sperm development. So that's an important one that we'll see later. And then, of course, the femoral nerve is also a pretty big nerve that has multiple levels involved in it. In the sacrococcygeal plexus, we have probably what's we would call probably the most well-known nerve of the body, which is the sciatic nerve. It is actually a combination of the tibial and fibular, and it is a very large nerve that runs through the greater sciatic notch, that's right there, and down the posterior side, and then into the thigh, and eventually these 2 split behind the knee. So in the popliteal region, they split into 2 separate nerves, the common fibular and the tibial. But basically, you know, the majority of your foot muscles and, you know, some hamstrings muscles, the posterior side of your leg is all going to deal with the sciatic nerve. And it is very commonly irritated and inflamed in people, and it really can be debilitating because it controls almost your entire lower leg along with the majority of your posterior thigh. Um, so definitely an important clinical nerve, and the muscles around it, things like piriformis and things like that. Okay, so now let's talk about what are called dermatomes. So these are the mapped out areas that each of these spinal nerves innervates. So you can see here that there's basically a map, remember location matters, of where each spinal nerve innervates the skin. Okay, so there's what are called cutaneous, so cutaneous is skin, cutaneous branches of each spinal nerve that are going to innervate the skin from all of these. So this is where you get your sensation. So if you feel something on your thumb, okay, that's going to come in on your C6 spinal nerve, okay? Now, every spinal nerve is going to participate in a dermatome except C1. The majority of them do overlap, so you don't get a complete lack of sensation if you have an issue with one of these. A really interesting time that you can see exactly where dermatomes are is when somebody is suffering from shingles. So shingles is going to affect specific spinal nerves, and the rash will erupt within a given dermatome, not necessarily bilateral. So we could see just this area right here being affected. And so that would indicate that the left T2 was having a problem. So that's kind of a clinical way that you can really actually see where these dermatomes are.